Okay, good. So I'm going to try and do this in 15 minutes or less because these YouTubes, well, they require that you have 15 minutes or less. Um, all right, so I want to introduce this idea of why are we doing conservation and what are the targets of conservation. So in order to discuss these conservation policies, we have to first define what goals we're trying to achieve with those policies, and this leads to a bit of a dilemma. And just to presage this, it's because we don't have a singular goal for conservation. We have many goals for conservation, and we have many stakeholders who view those goals differentially, and that makes conserving or designing comprehensive conservation policies very difficult. Okay, why is my slide not advancing? Okay, there we go. So we can think about, in terms of thinking about conservation, we can think about a variety of different entities that we're trying to conserve, from genes all the way up to communities or ecosystems and biomes. We can think about whether we're conserving processes, whether we're trying to understand ecosystem dynamics and think about nutrient flux and maintaining services such as water delivery from forested systems down into our agricultural systems, or whether they're trying to maintain ecological and evolutionary processes such as natural selection amongst coexisting and interacting organisms. We also have different motivations for conservation. There's intrinsic values and economic values and ethical values that we may be trying to satisfy through conservation actions, and we'll talk a bit about each of those in just a minute. And so we also have these different social paradigms that drive our feelings about conservation, whether it's a sense of justice, a sense of ethical responsibility, or self-interest. So a fellow named Brian Norton wrote a book about environmental ethics, and in that book he said that most Americans, a strong majority, define themselves at a minimum as sympathetic to the environment, to environmental concerns. And for as long as I've been an adult, the concern for the environment has always been the top 5 of issues on Americans' minds. It's almost never in the top 2, and we know that elections almost always go on the top 1 or 2 and never down to number 3. So it's an important one, but it's not enough of an important one to drive elections at this point. A fellow named Smith wrote a book on environmental science, and in this book he says that most Americans believe that we can't continue to live the way we do, that we're living unsustainably, and that without serious, we're having serious negative consequences to ecological systems, and that these are derived from a degraded environment. Now, this is also a strong majority. In fact, the majority on these views are way more than the number of people who believe climate change is actually happening or that evolution through natural selection occurs. And so it suggests that this cuts across a large swath of society, this faith in the idea that we ought to be protecting our environment. But those protections can come from a variety of different motivations, and so Norton characterizes these as basically describing arguments that have developed over the last half century or so, and that you can describe a motivation for conservation as being instrumentalism, or through instrumental values, that there's human benefit in the natural world and that we need to be able to conserve that natural world so that we can gain that human benefit. And that can be anything from ecosystem services like pollinators pollinating crops, or forests and throughput of water through those ecosystems into giving us healthy rivers, or it could be medicinal benefits of plants. And there are others on the other end that suggest that there's an intrinsic value to nature, that we don't have the right to harm other species, and that we have and so that those species have a right unto themselves, and that these are existence rights for other species, and that we also have an obligation to future generations to leave a system that's full of nature. So Brian Norton's thesis in this book that I described is suggesting that this dichotomization is probably not the best approach to thinking about this, and that's based on some faulty assumptions, even though we do this all the time. But one of them is that it says that it harkens to moral monism, that we suggest that we each have actually a singular ethic, and we probably don't. We probably see both sides of the coin on that one, and that it's a placeless evaluation. That this valuation that we have is independent of the case study, and that may not be the case. We may think that pandas have a right to exist, and we think that they're very important just in and of their own sake, but we might be mostly concerned about protecting, say, the Sierra Nevada for ecosystem services rather than the species that are there. It also draws this sharp, so it's just drawing this sharp distinction between intrinsic and instrumental valuation. This dichotomization also happens to have an entity orientation, so that we seem to be thinking about things like the rhinoceros. Are we protecting the rhinoceros because it has an intrinsic value or because it has an instrumental value? Or are we protecting marshes because they have intrinsic value or an instrumental value? And that we maybe ought to be thinking about process-oriented goals, and that this would help change the nature of that conversation. But basically, doing this, he argues for environmental pluralism, and we'll talk a bit about that as we go through the quarter. Within the U.S., we have some dominant social paradigms that drive a lot of what we do as a nation, and that this comes crashing headlong into conservation in many different places. So, for example, we hold private land in very high regard. That life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness includes the right of private landowners to use their land as they see fit, and that we get angry when people tell us we can't do something on our own private land. Now, obviously, that's not true in the absolute, that we have zoning laws that says you can't build a building of this kind in this neighborhood or in that neighborhood. You can't turn any old house in any old neighborhood into any kind of establishment that the neighbors might think is an unsavory business, like turning putting a bar next to an elementary school is a bad idea, and generally we zone against things like that. And then we have public lands, and we expect that we have right of access to those public lands, and that these are public goods, and that we have a government that manages those public goods in our interest. So there we have these tensions that suggest what we should be doing with public and private land, and these tensions go way back. So Gifford Pinchot was really single-handedly responsible for the initiation of the Forest Service, but he drove his values really from an instrumental view, that he felt that forests were there to be used. John Muir, in contrast, felt that we needed to have natural areas for nature's sake, and that had this intrinsic value perspective. But the problem is that if the public lands that we have are inadequate for our conservation goals, and generally they are, then we have to think about what rights of citizens to do what they will with their private land do we have to curtail in order to meet the objectives, and how do we go about doing that? And that's really a crux of a lot of social issues with conservation worldwide. So we have, so expanding that argument out, we also need to be thinking about how that justice component of people and their freedom carries to our neighbors. And so because if an individual has a right to freedom, then this also carries a responsibility for social justice. So there are international laws governing good neighborliness across countries. There is a lot of effort being paid attention to now among social groups and environmental justice within the U.S. But we also think about this with respect to different species. Are all species equally valuable? Do we care just as much about a plant as we do a primate? So we have lots of different things that drive challenges in thinking about policies that can guide our conservation of resources at all different levels. Okay, so what we're really looking for often is information, and that this information can be used to drive rational choices. And so, for example, in the U.S., we often think that a free market economic solution should prevail, that we should be able to design, or I guess that's not the word I'm looking for, but describe the value of something and conserving it, and then ask what the cost and the benefit of conserving that entity, and then decide whether it's worth the cost. Are the benefits worth the cost? Problem is that this doesn't work very well for many different conservation problems. We'll talk about those as the quarter goes along. The other dominant paradigm that we have is that we believe that science ought to inform policy decisions, and yet it's very difficult to see the fingerprint of science in many decisions. And so we'll talk about the challenges of getting science into the decision-making process as we go through our problems. So there have been a variety of different approaches to conservation, and we can divide these up into a wilderness model, a wise use model, a wildlife and biodiversity protection model, and an ecosystem management model. And there are different laws and policies that really govern each of those kinds of approaches to conservation, and each of them has their strengths and their weaknesses. But there's also sort of a timeline that we started with the wilderness model and have moved towards the ecosystem management model as time has progressed. And that we're going to think about conservation policy during the quarter within its historical context, that protectionism is really where conservation started, this idea of protecting habitats and setting them aside for nature, and that a lot of this had to do with this being set aside for the elites of society, most of the national parks of Tanzania were hunting reserves for relatively wealthy Europeans to go hunt in Africa for big game. The idea that we conserve grandeur versus biodiversity, that most of the national parks in the western United States are at very high elevation, and by design, and as a consequence, in areas of relatively low biodiversity, that the coasts of California have many more species than do the Sierra Nevada, for example. And so this protectionism is really where we initiated in conservation, but there's been a lot of critiques of protectionism, that we have that there are ecological impacts of excluding humans, there are pragmatic problems with this approach, and that there's problems of equity and ethics in setting aside areas for protection. And so we're now focusing on a set of new directions for conservation policy, moving from species to ecosystems, engaging local people in the conservation of their natural resources, and thinking about other issues such as climate change. So I more or less talked through this one already, but I'm going to skip forward to this here slide. And what this shows is the World Database on Protected Areas from 2004. And what you see is that the number of protected areas that have been created each year is now declining, that we're not putting in as much land into conservation as we did during the 1900s. We put a lot of new land into conservation each and every year, and that we're starting to level off, or in other words, becoming saturated with how much set-aside land we're doing for conservation. And as a consequence, a lot of the effort in conservation has been thinking about working with private landowners, integrating their values into protecting what biological diversity we can within the context of private lands. And so that we have really, in terms of thinking about policies, we have everything that apply from those that apply to public lands to those that apply on private lands. And we're coming up on 15 minutes, and that's the length of time I can put up on this little YouTube site. So I think I'm going to end it there, but invite you to take a look at the slides that accompany this first lecture. It goes up to about slide 40. I only got to, I think, slide 32 or something like that. But it goes through some of these challenges with this idea of protectionism and some of the directions that conservation has been moving as a consequence of that failure. Now, just to finish off, there will be a couple of readings for Wednesday. One of them is by Carly Cook, and it's on the idea of boundary organizations, or this idea of how scientists and resource managers can form groups so as to better implement science into conservation policy. And so it's going to help frame for us thinking about science and the role of science in conservation policy for the quarter. Okay, so that's it. Kat will take back over, and we'll be done for the day pretty quickly. So thanks, and I'll see you all on Wednesday.